I grew up in a cult. I first realized that I was living in a cult when I was 10 years old. I was in 5th grade. Naturally, I didn't fully understand what a cult is. But I had a sense that everyone around me had been indoctrinated and were following a certain dogma, regardless of whether that doctrine was of any benefit to them or most people. And that was the time that I dedicated myself to escaping, to getting out, to leaving that cult. Now, the moment that we realize that we're living in a cult, the vast majority of the power of that cult is broken. And I noticed very quickly that the main difficulty that I would have in doing anything about this cult was simply in convincing people that they were members of a cult. Because people are quite suggestive. And we are contagious. And when we're surrounded by a lot of people who just accept the way things are, it's very difficult for us to do anything else. It's very difficult for us to question the way that we're looking at the world when everyone around us is agreeing to look at it in that way. So, naturally, starting at that age, as I sat in my 5th grade classroom looking out the window at the playground, starting at that moment, things got lonely. Because not only was I looking at things in a different way from everyone else, as many of you may have heard in cults, if you question the basic doctrine, then you are seen as a real threat. And there can be terrible consequences. And certainly the cult I grew up in threatens us with those consequences. So what sort of a cult is this? Well, in this particular cult, we worship a fictional entity, a myth that we imagine is the source of happiness and safety. No one has ever seen this entity. We just make it up all the time. And we talk about it a great deal, and we repeatedly tell each other that we must cultivate our relationship with it, and that if you don't have a good relationship with it, then you are lost. We develop vast systems designed around this fictional entity. Systems that create enormous oppression, genocide, the destruction of entire ecosystems. People are given power in this system only if they have passed through a long period of indoctrination. Period that's between 10 and 20 years. The entire period of that indoctrination, everyone is tracked to record on a yearly basis, and in fact on a daily basis, how fully they have been indoctrinated. And if parents refuse to give up their children to this system of indoctrination, then they're punished, and often the children are taken away from those parents. Once a person's moved through that system, then the power, the privilege that they're given depends both on their family history of indoctrination and also on their own ability to demonstrate their willingness to abide by the assumptions of this particular cult. Now you might say, well, none of that sounds too bad. What's the big problem? What evil thing is this cult doing? Well, anything in order to support this fictional entity. In fact, even the destruction of life on this planet. We've demonstrated our commitment to this by destroying millions of species already. In this particular area, this particular country, this cult has eliminated about half of the animals living here in the past 50 years. Consider all of the animals, large animals, larger than a mouse, we have killed, which are easily recorded. We've killed off about half of those in the past 50 years. And we are very willing to create new technologies that are even more destructive. And in fact, we energetically invent, produce more of those technologies every day. So, what cult is this? Well, it's a cult like any other. It claims to be excellent, wonderful. You may know that the word cult is actually originally a very good word. It's related to the word culture or cultivate. It means that we develop ourselves. We do our best to develop ourselves. We try to become better people. That's what a cult is. A cult is a system that attempts to make us into better people. That's all. And naturally, we see that there's a great danger in that intent. But there are also good things. This cult, like every cult, has a lot of good qualities. And many of those qualities are the development of our character, the development of our society. This cult, like others, has solved a lot of problems and has created a lot of problems. There are good things about it and bad things about it. We don't want to be too simplistic about this. Nonetheless, we should acknowledge that something should be done about this cult of modern culture. What is it? It's hard to say what it is because it's something that we all accept. There are different forms of it, of course. There's something called capitalism, something called modernism, something called humanism. These various sects, these various pawns of the larger culture are useful handles, but don't contain the whole story in any one of them. In any case, the basic entity that is worshipped by more people than I believe any other fictional entity ever has been, is money. We all feel that we need it and work for it and agree to make use of it in concert with each other. And we absolutely believe in it as a culture, as a world culture. It is seen as the ultimate, most trustworthy good. And as I say, we've come to a point now when it is more important to us than the existence of life. And we've come to the place that so many cults come to when we're willing to give up our lives for this fiction, for this imaginary idea, and give up other people's lives for it. Certainly give up our happiness, but sacrifice our children, sacrifice this beautiful planet for a fictional idea. Now, as I say, the difficulty with talking to people who are in a cult is that it's very difficult to convince them that they are. One of the defense mechanisms that's used is pointing at all of those other things that are so bad, shifting the conversation to all of those other cults, all of those other groups that do so much bad. For example, when I first went to Japan, right around that time, some of you may know that there were some subway attacks in which poisonous gas was released and a number of people were killed and more were injured by a certain cult there in Japan. And my mother heard about this and naturally was very worried that maybe I was going to Japan and was going to join such a cult. She was very concerned about that. We're aware of other cults that maybe don't kill a lot of people, but there is a certain amount of oppression. There's a kind of delusion that's shared. And that delusion creates blind spots because that's what delusion is. And then suffering is created as a result of that. And we can point and say, well, this cult hurt these people, maybe hurt or even killed some children. This cult is taking money from the members of it. This cult was engaging in sexual violence. We can point at those problems. But I have to say that when my mother was concerned about me joining such a cult, even though I was only a teenager, I was only 18, I had been dealing with this problem at that point for just consider 8 years, which is about half of my life. And I was already beyond that kind of fear. Why? Because I could point at the cult that I was leaving. Say, yes, it's true that these cults do some bad, but cults like that never grow very big. They get to a few hundred, maybe a few thousand members, and then they just fall off. This cult that I'm leaving contains billions of members. And they all function unquestioning, in concert, very quickly, causing the destruction of the most beautiful thing on this planet, life. Constant, unrelenting destruction. And within that, of course, is terrible sexual violence, the killing of children. These are things that the people in this cult work hard to fund every day with their taxes. Constant funding of these activities without worry about it, taking it as a matter of course that we would, of course, kill children. How else would you run the system anyway? I was always amazed talking to Americans, since I know refugees from various countries, amazed that Americans aren't concerned about the activities that we engage in on a daily basis, even with regard to activities like killing innocent children. Much less activities like destroying this planet, destroying our lives, destroying the lives of our own children. But that's what happens when you're indoctrinated so deeply. It's very difficult to see out of the system. And I had spent years working on seeing something larger than this system. Spent a good portion of my life, almost half of my life, trying to see outside of that system. And so, I felt very confident because I had taken on a much larger and more powerful cult than any little band of uneducated, incompetent criminals who were releasing nerve gas. And I went there in order to fully release myself, in order to work hard to fully get out, to fully leave this cult that I grew up in, to fully acknowledge the terrible suffering that was being created. And as many of you have noticed, once you enter this path, a lot more suffering is being created than we at first noticed. We noticed that there was too much, and so we started working on it, only to realize that there is far, far more. And this cult runs far, far deeper in our minds than we originally suspected. And so the work became more intense, more difficult, but I worked through that work due to a great deal of support from very kind people. And again, I noticed that I was being asked to deeply question, not to merely accept, but actually question, that I was the one who was refusing to question. It's been interesting here recently, as I have more and more often asked people, why are we doing it this way? What's the reason for that? I've noticed some of you now are even asking each other why. It's unfortunate, but to me not at all surprising, having watched myself move through this process, that we don't really want to know. We consistently give answers like, well, that we've always done it that way, or that's what so-and-so said. We even say that when always is a matter of months or years, and so-and-so might have been here for a shorter period of time than we were. It turned out to be very difficult to question these things. Once a community starts functioning in a certain way, it takes a lot of effort to wonder why. And the most wonderful part of this, to me, is watching the group demonstrate our self-indoctrination, our desire to be indoctrinated, our attempt to continually not know, not understand, not question, not be heedful, not hold the power that we have over our own minds. We don't want it. We want someone else to have that on our behalf, because it's a lot of responsibility. It takes a lot of discipline to cultivate our own minds. So we want someone else to do it for us, and that's what's called a cult. When we're unwilling to cultivate our own minds, then we're in a cult, because someone will do it for us. Someone will be happy to take that responsibility on our behalf. The nice thing about being here is, as you've noticed, no one is really that happy about taking that responsibility on your behalf. Everybody wants you to grow up and take a look, even if we don't want to do that ourselves. As we refuse to do that ourselves, we see the sorts of answers that we give. We give arbitrary answers that don't make sense. The good news is that since we haven't gotten so ossified yet that we all agree on those answers, we notice that they don't make sense. It's totally different from going into a large, vast worldwide cult and ask questions like, why did you pay for that? Well, that's a very confusing question. You say, well, you have to pay for it. We've always paid for it. That's why. People pay for things. That's the kind of answer we give. You can look a little closer and say, well, money is this thing that we came up with and we use, and you have to pay for things, otherwise there wouldn't be an effective system of distribution. But all of that, if you've stepped out of it, all of that contains countless assumptions. And as we question those assumptions, as we deeply question those assumptions, we awaken to the possibility that all of them can be changed. Now, that system of assumptions has a name. There's a word for it. We have a word for it, and it is culture. Culture is the word for it. Our vast network of assumptions about the way things are and should be is our culture. It's not at all surprising, as I said, that the word culture and the word cult are so similar. Here we have a mission, and it is to create a contemplative culture for the modern world. This contemplative culture means that we acknowledge the importance to people of being in a cult, of being indoctrinated, that people like that. It's a huge responsibility to not do that at all. To totally question. That's very difficult. And most people are not willing to question at that level. We acknowledge that. This was one of the, most grounding and most saddening realizations in my training. That it wasn't going to be enough for me to escape. That wasn't sufficient for me. My original intent wasn't merely to escape from this life-destroying cult. My original intent actually was to save life from this cult of the modern human society. And that in order to do that, I would need to create a path out of it. But a path out of it means being in it. The metaphor, which is very helpful, very important for the sorts of people who would come to a place like this to hear, because the sort of people who would come to a place like this are typically quite idealistic. Especially about the way things should be. We're not always that idealistic about the way we ourselves should be. But the way things should be, we're often quite idealistic. And a useful metaphor in order to understand why that doesn't work is that if you are in prison and you want to get out, and someone finds a way out. Let's say someone finds a way out of prison. You're in prison and someone finds a way out. If they want to help you to get out, then they have to tell you a path. They have to explain to you the path that will take you out of prison. And that entire path is in prison. The whole path out of prison is in prison. If you look at this room, here we are in this room, you want to walk out of that door to get out of this room. The entire path you will walk will be in this room. The entire path out of this room is in this room. The same way, the entire path out of this culture is in this culture. You can say, yeah, but I hate it. I don't want to be a part of it. Well, okay. Then let's get out of it. How? By walking in it. By walking in it in a certain way. It isn't enough merely to reject it. We can come to the point, of course, in our training when we're capable of just rejecting it, of escaping from it. We can get there. But I want to be clear, while that's very difficult and very few people ever come to the point when they can do that, relative to this larger task, that's easy. Now I know that the statistics would say that the thing I'm calling easy is so hard that very few people, even here in this room, will actually achieve it. I know, it's that hard. How many people total will achieve it? Very, very, very few. Nonetheless, that's relatively easy relative to the larger task of guiding the world, guiding even just one person, but certainly guiding the world out of this cult. That's extremely difficult, but that is the leadership that you are all being trained to embody. And if you don't know that, then not much that we do here will make sense. It won't make sense why we do things in the way we do. But if you know that, then it makes sense. If you understand that, then this makes sense. It makes sense that we would be expected to fully question our own assumptions, our own minds, to fully escape, but to escape with the compassionate intent of being of service to the world. To have that initial intent so that we can become the people with supreme power in the world. And who are those people? Those are the people who create culture, who create the shared assumptions of the human race. If we're capable of questioning those assumptions, then we're capable of escaping from them. But just because we escape from them doesn't mean we're capable of doing the next step, which is to create new assumptions that tend to bring people to the escape from them. We're creating a system that guides people out of delusion, and having done that, it itself is seen to be delusion, and people escape from even that. It's a system, spiritual system, that is designed for obsolescence. It is a self-destroying cult. It does guide us, but once we come to the point of having passed beyond other forms of delusion, this form also falls. And then we see the truth, and having seen the truth, which is without any assumptions and without any preferences whatsoever, once we see the truth, then the true journey begins, which is to return and find a way to create a new culture. This is a supreme power. This is supreme leadership. So, if I've succeeded in conveying my message, then you will, at the very least, break out in a sweat. Perhaps you will start to cry, to weep. You'll fall on the ground and despair when I tell you what I'm about to tell you. You are in a cult. So I see I haven't conveyed my message this evening. But as I say, it's very difficult to explain to people the horror of this cult that we have grown up in, that we've been indoctrinated into. So it's not surprising that I failed to explain it to you, that none of you are now weeping on the ground. It is nonetheless your job here to break through those assumptions, to see that if you're in the world, if you're functioning in the world, you're functioning in a cult. It's just how it is. The question is, are you at the very least capable of seeing through that? And at most, capable of transforming it. If you can't see through it, you cannot transform it. You will serve it. It has ways of bending your mind to its own purposes. But if you can see through it, if you can become free from it, then a much more difficult stage begins. How to transform it. This means that you come to the point when wisdom, which is the ability to see through this cult, and love, which is the intent to be of service, of true service to all living things, brings forth the power to create a new set of assumptions, the true power, the true leadership in the world, to design, develop, cultivate a new culture. If we have power without those two, without wisdom and love, then we have no power at all. Because we're just serving the patterns of the cult that we've been enslaved to. You're here to gain true power. True power is based on wisdom, true insight, and love, true compassion. First and foremost, realize that. Realize it completely. And with that, become a person who can create a new future, not one merely determined by the patterns of the past. A new future. Please know that while we have to do this together, none of us can push off this responsibility on anyone else. Therefore, we each must purify our own minds for the benefit of all living things.